Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Cyril Velikanov, retired IT engineer with mathematical background. I'm born Russian, naturalized French. Presently I live in Russia and work on my project at home with no other collaborators and no academic affiliation. Indeed, I have no connection with any Russian governmental or political institutions. Apart from a few publications in Russian several years ago, all my written output related to my project is in English and can be seen on my researchgate.net or academia.edu pages. My actual presentation at the SO 2021 conference continues a series of my earlier papers and conference talks, all devoted to my project. The title of this project was, at different times, Mass Online Deliberation, Direct Deliberative Democracy, Direct Participatory Governance, etc. All these titles reflect different aspects of the project. My actual presentation is entitled Citizens as Affected Patients and as Concerned and Engaged Actors in a Democratic Decision-Making Process. It aims at juxtaposing liberal and utilitarian approaches to democracy to show first how these two assumedly opposing principles do effectively cohere in real representative settings, and second, how the two principles can work together in a still theoretical direct participatory setting that I will try to briefly present on these slides. The slides themselves are uploaded onto the OS 2021 site and can be browsed there. The government of the people, by the people and for the people. Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address. This famous triple formula intuitively shows the three interconnected aspects of relationship between a citizen and his or her state, nation, society, or community. To be subjected to laws and rules in vigor, to be a political actor, a citizen influencing the life of the society, and to be a political patient supported by the society. So we start with juxtaposing the two concepts of governance, liberalism versus utilitarianism, citizens as actors versus citizens as patients. Jeremy Bentham proclaimed that the objective of government is the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Almost 2 centuries later, this utilitarian formula is still commented and criticized by liberals. The French philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis expresses the liberal credo in these words: "The objective of politics is not happiness but freedom." John Stuart Mill already tried to reconciliate the two camps by defending state support while rejecting state paternalism. Let us briefly look at this concept. A voter is an actor just for a very short time, all the way after he is a patient. Hence, every cycle of representative democracy is volitional at start, but consequentialist and even utilitarian all the way after. With regard to non-voters, any government is indeed paternalistic. But who are those voters and non-voters? The secrecy of ballot puts all the citizens on the same footing. Another problem with secret ballot is that a voter in elections performs an act having public effects. Hence, every voter whose candidate won the elections should be considered personally, though indirectly, responsible for the consequences of his or her act of voting, while the non-voters and the losing voters bear no such responsibility. Because of voting secrecy, for yet another time, all are put on the same footing of undiscoverable and untraceable responsibility. When we turn to direct democracy in its classical referendum-based implementation, we can see that the two aspects, volitional and consequential, become inseparable and intertwined. In a typical referendum with secret ballot, we see the same problem of implicit and untraceable paternalism toward non-voters, complemented with the same problem of untraceable responsibility of voters. Our previous considerations lead us to the concept of secrecy, that is, of confidentiality, which is opposed to the natural requirements of integrity, continuity, and responsibility of political actors. Participatory democracy intends to draw into its governance processes as many citizens as possible. Hence, the above-stated dilemma becomes yet more acute. I'll briefly present my proposed solution based on using unique, registered, permanent pseudonyms. Physical self and political self, the seemingly incompatible requirements. As a physical self and as a political patient, every person clearly prefers and will always prefer confidentiality. As a political actor, especially as a simple voter, many would still prefer confidentiality, instilled in them by the so customary secret ballot. However, the more our governance becomes participatory, the more everyone will be drawn into accepting to be known and trusted for one's political acts, thus building one's stable political image. An additional aspect is that the society, through its governance system, needs personal information about its members and as patients for providing them with more targeted and more efficient service. A solution would consist in disconnecting one's political self from one's physical self. Every citizen registers in the governance information system, briefly the system, under a unique permanent pseudonym, under which he or she will be known to the system and to the community, and will be able to gradually build his or her virtual political self, VPS. One-way ciphering, hash coding, of the citizen's identification data will assure registration uniqueness while keeping one's physical self undiscoverable, that is, unrecoverable from one's pseudonym. One's identity as a political person is conditioned by one's personal system of interests. These are, in more detail, vital interests or needs, other non-vital interests, and values. Also may be beliefs and attitudes, but these will not be considered now. Altogether, these elements form what we call one's preference profile. Every virtual political self should be assigned some storage in the system, accessible only to its physical owner and partially to the system. This storage is the right place to keep one's preference profile confidentially. Knowing the needs and other preferences of citizens will allow the governance system to better serve them as patients, as compared with any today's government that can only conjecture on citizens' needs. Also, the system will be able to better personalize voting advices on choices to be made by citizens participating in various decision-making processes. The system will be also able to rapidly and efficiently stratify the community in order to form a randomly selected panel every time when needed to perform a specific action in a governance process. Everyone has a number of objective characteristics that implicitly define with great certainty one's needs and also, less certainly, some of one's less essential interests. These characteristics may include age, family status, age of children, profession, family income, habitation type and location, health, chronic diseases, disabilities. They form what is often called one's socio-economic status, SES. If one's SES is pre-filled as part of one's preference profile, the system can derive one's needs from it. Filling a personal SES may be done by the person based on trust or on a formal proof, for example by importing certified records from public registries. One's SES and one's personal NIV preference profile describe a person as a patient. Both should remain in the double confidentiality zone. That means that other community members should not have access to these data, neither under one's physical name nor even under one's pseudonym. In contrast, a political activity record of a politically active citizen should better be open to all other community members, indeed under pseudonym. One's political activity within the system takes place under one's permanent pseudonym only. Thus, if a person's proposals, opinions, evaluations, etc. are always open to others, this will promote integrity and continuity of everyone's political behavior while increasing the trust without creating fear of any harm to a personal physical self. Now we will speak about a three-step passage from patient to actor: affected by, concerned with, engaged in. By the way, Clive Barnett, in his recent book The Priority of Injustice, proposes a similar threefold heuristic distinguishing between being affected, being moved, and having agency. To be affected by is a passive condition. A person affected, either negatively or positively, by a public action or inaction, or potentially affected by a public policy decision in a community, can be considered as a patient of the community, a political patient. A political patient may or may not become a political actor, that is, become engaged in some political process. Prior to becoming engaged in a political process related to an issue that affects him or her, a political patient becomes concerned with the issue. To be concerned with is an internal state of a person. We should distinguish between subjectively and objectively assessed affectedness. One's affectedness by an issue that is only emotionally perceived by the person or assessed by him based on more explicit considerations remains his or her subjective affectedness. If, however, one's affectedness has been assessed by the system or by the community assisted by the system, then it is an objective affectedness. When dealing with contradictory issues, objectively assessed affectedness would provide for more fairness in public decision-making. One's motives for becoming concerned with an issue be self-interests, or compassion to others, or solidarity with the entire community. The social choice approach considers all participants in a political process as rational agents concerned with their own interests only. We, in contrast, will try to account for other motives as well. Engaged in is not a binary condition, but may pass through several distinct levels of engagement. We distinguish the following levels. First, getting better informed. Second, evaluating, selecting, ranking, voting without arguing. Intuitive. Third, considering proposed advices, engaging oneself in inner deliberation. The fourth level, publicly arguing for or against others' arguments, non-creative deliberation. And fifth, publicly moving and defending own proposals, creative deliberation. Those concerned not always become engaged. Here we enumerate various causes of non-participation. On this and the next slides, I'll try to classify various causes for people affected by some public issue to refrain from any participative engagement in the process of solving the issue. My idea is that most of those causes have appropriate remedies. Here and in a few other places I skip details in order to make my video presentation a bit shorter. The next topic we need to introduce and discuss is all affected interests and proportionality. The all affected interests principle, formulated half a century ago by Robert Dahl, states that all who are affected by a decision should have a right to participate into making it. Since then, it had been regularly criticized but regularly resurges, attracting every time more and more attention. The criticism mostly turns around the question, what are those interests that should be considered, and at what extent? The replies are always too vague to become operationalized. Considering affectedness as quantifiable concept, if possible, would make the concept much more productive. Salvation comes from the proportionality principle as formulated in 2010 by Breyhaus and Fleur-Bae. Power in any decision-making process should be proportional to individual stakes, and with more precision in 2020 by Angel and Hughesby. We shall enfranchise all and only those people whose interests are affected by a decision, and we shall assign voting rights in positive proportion to people's degree of affectedness, measured for each decision separately. By the way, here the all affected and the proportionality principles definitely presuppose direct rather than representative mode of governance. I propose a yet more precise formula dealing with the citizen both as a patient and as an actor. Here is the formula. In a public decision-making, one's interests and one's participatory actions in support of those shall be weighted proportionally to the degree at which these interests are affected by the decision. Our next step consists in considering and measuring affectedness of one's interests, not only for each issue separately, but also for every specific interest separately. This leads us to yet more precise formulation, which I will not recite but propose to read on the slide. This mapping of interests into aspects of a decision, or vice versa, is supposed to be quantifiable. Now I present my own project called Direct Participatory Governance, in which the already discussed ideas of explicitly dealing citizens as actors and as patients, of a virtual political self, of the all-affected interests, and of proportionality meet a number of other concepts to be discussed a few slides later. The three foundational principles of direct participatory governance are: first, openness and inclusiveness. The policy-making process in a community shall be open to every citizen. This formal openness should be complemented by real inclusiveness. This means that causes of non-participation should be alleviated and that the community should bring help to every its member for making everyone's participation easier and more productive. Second, fairness, to provide all participants with equal opportunities at every level when submitting their input, appraising others' inputs, voting, etc. And third, economy of time and efforts. Citizens typically will be willing and able to devote only a fraction of their time, if any at all, to the process of solving an issue, even when they feel concerned with it. Hence, every stage of the process and every activity to be performed at every stage must be designed in a way to minimize every citizen's time and efforts to spend. While every citizen is encouraged to participate, they will do it at different levels of engagement and of participation. We can roughly distinguish three main levels: creative participation, the highest level, moving proposals and arguments; evaluative participation, appraising without arguing the input of others; and the lowest level, self-representing participation, filling one's preference profile to make it easier for the society to serve the person as a patient. Behind this slide, an effort of several years is hidden, aimed to develop a model and a procedural framework for a mass common online deliberation, MOD, described in detail in one of my, with Professor Prosser, previous works. Implementing MOD will allow for an arbitrarily large community to deliberate over an issue altogether, as if being in one common room, as opposed to parallel deliberation in multiple small groups. MOD is indeed a method of open participation. However, it expects from citizens creative participation, the most demanding in time and efforts. In my other 2017 paper, I propose a method for assisting the least prepared participants in their argumentation efforts. For the sake of time efficiency, in direct participatory governance, every decision-making process will comprise only one fully deliberative MOD stage, the stage of moving and discussing proposals for future solutions. For other, mostly evaluative stages, a much more time and efforts economical device is proposed, that of deliberating within a limited size, randomly selected panel of citizens assisted by experts. Experts to assist citizens in their decision-making should be selected based on their rating. I propose to consider three distinct components in an expert's rating: professional aptitudes, integrity, and communication skills, to be assessed in different ways, by colleagues, by citizens, by clients and students. Now we pass on to yet other concept we use in our project and in our today's considerations. Multi-criteria public decision-making. It originates from the basic or classical concept of multi-criteria decision-making, well known and largely used in corporate and institutional settings. MCDM replaces a non-detailed and often mostly intuitive assessment and comparison of alternatives with their more detailed and more precise assessment on a per-criterion basis. Elaboration of an appropriate list of criteria for such an assessment is indeed a separate task, usually performed by experts in the field. On the next few slides, I explain how MCDM can be transformed for serving another purpose, that of public participatory decision-making. The basic process of MCDM comprises the stages of formulating an issue, formulating criteria or requirements on alternative solutions to be proposed, move and discuss or deliberate various proposals or ideas for possible solutions, assort them into clusters, edit a few parameterized alternative solutions, rank the alternative solutions according to their levels of conformance to every criterion, where stages D and E are already presented in a MOD style to fit our participatory design. When there is a whole group of decision makers rather than a single one, a couple of new steps appear at the end of the process. Namely, an alternatives to criteria conformance table is presented to every DM, decision maker, to facilitate their reasonable vote. Then all DM vote, for example, by ranking the alternatives, each the DM according to his or her preferences. And finally, the system performs an algorithmic work, sometimes very hard one, to find out an optimal solution that will be more or less satisfactory for every DM, rather than a majority decision imposed by one group of DMs on another group. Now we try to replace a group of corporate or institutional decision makers by a much larger group of citizens decision makers. This passage is not purely quantitative. For citizens in the decision maker's role are a much less homogeneous group, often less informed and almost always having mutually contradicting goals and interests. At this point, our participatory MCDM design meets our per-interest effectiveness considerations discussed earlier. Namely, we should establish some correspondence between criteria for assessing alternatives and interests for assessing effectiveness. Let us call this correspondence mapping. The mapping stage of the decision-making process will be performed by a stratirandomly panel of citizens, may be assisted by experts. The mapping of criteria onto interests will allow to express alternatives conformance table in terms of interests rather than criteria, and present it to every citizen decision maker as kind of voting advice, not yet personalized. All steps introduced until now are presented on this slide in their order of execution. Now our public decision-making process finally meets the proportionality principle, namely, the system looks up every citizen's preference profile and SES characteristics, calculates some issue-dependent additional characteristics when appropriate, and computes every person's per-interest effectiveness by the issue at hand. Note that this operation does not involve any other human participants, who simply have no access to preference profiles of others. On the basis of this per-interest affectedness of a participant, the system finally calculates his or her individual affectedness proportional per interest voting rights. On this slide, I give a rather preliminary presentation of the proposed voting rights calculation method and of how these voting rights are to be used at the votes aggregation stage. We are now almost at the end of our journey. Once the voting rights are calculated, citizens are invited to vote, and there are multiple options of doing that. These options depend on everyone's individual level of engagement and also on whether a person votes following his or her self-interest concern or some compassion or solidarity concern. The first voting mode to be considered is the implicit or passive vote. Namely, if a citizen does not show up for a final vote, the system uses the choices calculated for that citizen as the most probable for him, for her, based on the previously computed individual preferences, that is, on the voting advice previously proposed by the system to that citizen. Here, the citizen is clearly dealt with as patient only. However, being alerted by the system about the imminent implicit vote, the citizen will have yet time to wake up and vote him or herself, either following or not following the voting advice given by the system. In this way, that person's vote turns to become the active self-interest vote. Voting rights normally should be applied in this case as well as in case of a passive vote. Here we enter a field that needs further investigation and hence is presented here at the discussion point only. When the self-interest vote stage is over, the system will be able to stratify the entire community of voters, both active and passive ones, according to some common traits in their profiles and in their votes. Now, it may be the right time for some voters, for example, to those only marginally affected by the issue at hand, to add their votes to those of a system-discovered group that the marginal voter feels or considers as needing support. These votes shall not be weighted, but they should not be allowed to strengthen the voter's own position, that is, to increase the voter's own self-interest voting right. Continuing with compassion vote, we can note that the most natural case for this kind of vote to be meaningfully defined is within a decision-making on issues with multiple outcomes, or when a limited resource is to be divided or distributed. This type of issues needs, however, a redesigning decision-making process, and therefore needs further investigations. To conclude this presentation, I propose a few slides on which I consider two special cases where the usage of some of the basic concepts appears theoretically justified and practically efficient. The first is the problem of trans-border participatory decision-making. The all-affected interest principle indeed works overtly against and across any administrative or state border. The question is how it could work in the context of separate decision-making centers, separate budgets, and different taxation systems. The second question is about granting voting rights for minors. I mean teenagers, indeed, with voting rights increased with age, while the remaining portion of the unitary vote is offered to the teenagers' parents, the latter proposal is known as demone voting. At the very end, I raise a few questions that need further investigation. The first is about positive affectedness. This factor must be accounted for, however, it is not clear how this can be done. The second question is about issues with multiple outcomes, for example, when a limited resource is to be divided. If we try to consider direct public participation in such a case, how individual per interest affectedness could be defined and calculated. Today's participatory budgeting schemes are of little use because they are always applied to a very small portion of the total budget and are typically about proposing some nice extras rather than seriously dealing with the core budget lines. Thank you for your attention and patience. Your comments, questions, and criticism are more than welcome.